Welcome to Season 2 of Solutions for Mental Wellness. On today's podcast, we have Zach Miller with us. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist, and he's also a certified addictions counselor. For the past 5 years, Zach had worked in addictions counseling. He's actually developing his own model for working with individuals in recovery, and he and I have been together since 2018. And welcome, Zach.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So as we start our conversation today, I think we need to just talk through a few things with our listeners. One is, as licensed clinicians, we have the diagnostic criteria, and we have to have all sorts of clinical jargon. And so the DSM-5 TR is what we use for diagnosing people. And that language is pretty complicated and confusing. So today, let's make it so that everyone can understand what we're talking about when we talk about addictions. So can you just give a brief definition of what addictions is?
So addiction, we see it as a disease and treat it as a disease, which being a disease, we know that it has a disorder or a destructure or function. It has a known cause, and it also has a distinctive group of symptoms, signs, or anatomical changes that can be observed. A lot of the old ways of thinking about it have evolved from the idea of choice. But what we know is that choice does play a role, but in the disease part of addiction, we see it attack our function of choice, our function of, the way it separates us from our other connections. It's a disease of connection that attacks our choice. And we can see that not only relationally in the connections that we talk about, but also we have physical anatomical signs within the brain that we can observe through behaviors and other symptoms.
So when it comes to looking at addiction, it's not just clearly someone uses a substance and they're hooked on a substance and so they develop an addiction. It sounds like there's a whole lot involved with it, that it's a whole body, not just about the substance that's being used.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's this notion that substances have chemical hooks in them that we can't seem to get the barbs out of. But we have enough evidence that suggests that it's also in the connection piece, right? And if you look at something like the Vietnam War, there were tons of soldiers over there using heroin, weed, alcohol, and there was this thought of an epidemic coming back. But there were soldiers who returned who did continue to struggle with addiction. But we see a lot of people who returned who were able to return to normal everyday functioning, suggesting that connection piece was the important distinction in treating what may have been going on.
So not everyone who uses a substance, whether it's legal or illegal, becomes addicted.
Absolutely. If you look at our hospital systems, they use opioids to help address pain. So there's a lot of things that happen that if you didn't have that, the surgeries may not be possible.
Yes.
And so we see that they're being used in appropriate ways. It's what is happening that maybe creates the struggle to separate once returning to outside of that level of care even.
So coping has a lot to do with whether or not someone's going to stay in active use and develop an addiction. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit more about the role coping plays with substances?
Yeah, absolutely. On that, I'll speak to a bigger model of substance use and addiction treatment. I was trained from what's called a biological, psychological, social, spiritual, and experiential model of addiction. But it basically says that each one of those areas of connection where we struggle may be a way that we connect with a substance, and those are the areas that we need to find ways to cope. So if we struggle socially, alcohol has a lot of social aspects to it, how do we then find ways to socialize outside of that? For people that have experienced heavy amounts of trauma, in a psychological manner and are soothing through use, how do we begin to address the psychological and mental diagnosis and issues and symptoms in order to then address the addiction that's underlying?
Yeah. So when you talk about substance use, it sounds like that there's a lot more going on than just the fact that someone has had a tough time and they are looking for a way to change how they feel, and so they cope by using the substance. It sounds like that maybe they need to do some identity work with understanding who they are, and how they fit in where they belong. What do you think about that?
100%. I think that one of the things that I put in my back pocket, I heard somebody say one time, was the opposite of addiction isn't abstinence, it's actually connection. And so it's learning to connect with ourselves, whether that is through our physical body, through our spirituality, our presence in the world around us, as well as our relationships. Finding ways to address vulnerabilities, because addiction has this way of taking all of the things that we connect with, the activities that we enjoy, the people who provide meaningful relationships, the sense of presence and awareness in the everyday life even. It has a way of taking those and diminishing them and deteriorating them to where the only connection we have left is what the identified addiction is, whether that's alcohol, substance use, porn, gambling, shopping, eating, etc. And so a big part of recovery process and addiction treatment is finding those areas of connection and building back up on the pieces that maybe we've lost, as well as developing new sources of connection.
What's been most effective when you have worked with individuals who, or families, or couples who are coming in because they have been in active addiction and they're trying to get to recovery?
Yeah, I think that the first thing is to provide a source of connection that is not wavering, because, and I'll use the relationship piece, a lot of people whose loved ones have been impacted by addiction struggle to provide meaningful relationships because of their own hurts, their own exhaustion, their own need for healthy boundaries. And so oftentimes what happens is it threatens the connection, which then only increases these feelings of shame. And what we know is that shame is actually the engine that drives addiction. And so the first thing I would tell any clinician or anybody offering support to those that are seeking to treat their addiction is to find ways to offer sources of connection, whether that is just being that piece in the therapy room, whether it's being a constant, whether it's even offering just a safe space to talk.
I was reading this week in preparing for our podcast, and the piece of literature I was reading said that a holistic approach is best. And then I went on and they clarified and said it's not like you're doing everything at once, but you're looking at the person, the whole person, who they are individually, who they are within their family and their close relationships, their social settings, as well as in the workplace. And then you are building their support system. And so can you talk more about the importance of a healthy support system so that the person who's trying to overcome addiction can know that they have that stable connection?
Absolutely. I think, and going back to talking about how the disease of addiction challenges connection with the things that we enjoy and isolates us. Really, addiction, if you look at addiction as anything, see it's isolation, it's a need for something greater. And so finding ways to build that back up. Some people, may not have a healthy home life that they've come from, so the family and friends that they were with, engaged with, may not be a healthy environment to return. So it's finding who are the healthiest people to engage with. They may not have had healthy activities that they have anymore. So it's developing new activities to engage in. It could be that they don't have a sound or positive regard for themselves. And so it's developing a sense of self-worth and healing through their own challenges. In a spiritual aspect, it may be finding ways that they can engage. And I say spiritual, not even necessarily meaning religion or faith. That can be an avenue of it, but more how do we engage presently in the world around us? And then creating new experiences through that based on their needs. And so it's taking them and building back up, like the same way you would build a building, you need scaffolding around it. So we need to create scaffolding. But once the building is built back up, we can remove the scaffolding, and then you have an end result.
You have worked a lot with people in group therapy.
Yes.
How important is it for someone who's trying to work through addiction to be a part of group therapy?
Yeah, I think we know there's a lot of research that shows that individual or group therapy is incredibly effective. What I have found in group therapy is creating shared experiences challenges the isolation that comes with addiction. I think it's knowing that we're not alone. And not only does that challenge the isolation, it also challenges the narratives of shame, because shame has a way of telling us that we're not good enough, we're not worthy enough. And so when you have somebody else saying, I've been there, then we know there's this inclination of, I'm not alone, I'm not as isolated as I thought. And so it not only offers hope, it offers support, it creates some of that scaffolding. We can see, hey, what worked for you? Oh, and we can kind of at times cherry pick and say, well, I don't have, that may not work for me, but this will work for me, or I can try new experiences. So we're also gaining new insights and information that may not have been available, because we all come from different walks of life. We all have different personalities, and importantly, we have different perspectives. So gaining insight from other people's perspectives is also important, because then it goes, if I'm closed off to an experience, for example, because of XYZ, hearing somebody else say, well, this worked for me, may challenge that maybe it can or could work for me.
So the first time I ever worked as a therapist was actually in addictions. Okay. And I can remember the very first group meeting I was invited to participate in. I wasn't leading it, but I was invited to be a part of it. And it upset the balance of the group a little bit. And one of the participants said, why are you even here? You have no idea what it's like to be where we are. And I thought for a minute, and it took me back, because I'm like, yeah, you're right. My life doesn't look anything like yours. And then what came to mind was, no, but I do know, because my grandmother struggled with alcoholism her whole life, and she actually committed suicide. And so when I shared that, it changed everything, because the individuals that were in that group that night, they saw me as someone who was well educated, well put together, like I had everything going for me, and there was no way that I could relate with them. And then when I was vulnerable enough to open up and share my story, then that's where connection was. And I'm so glad that the person that I was working with had me go to group first before seeing individual clients, because that created the buy-in for the individual work that we did. One of the things that impacted me the most from my time there was, I had someone in my office, and she said that if she was to leave my office, she was going to go out and use. And she just sat there on the floor and she rocked back and forth. And I said, you stay here until you work through this. It's okay. We'll work through it together. And we did some cognitive behavioral therapy, and she stopped rocking. She was like, I can leave now. But it took having that connection in the room really for the change to happen, and then to think through, to take her from the physical feelings she was having then the emotional feeling she was having, and then walking her to where she could have a choice. Because in that moment, there was no choice. If she was to leave, she would have gone and gotten her substance, and it wasn't far away. And so by her being able to stay there, and she wasn't alone, and then we would just talk. There really isn't anything magical about that other than that connection piece.
I tell people there's not a whole lot new under the sun that they can expect to learn from me, but it is dusting off old tools and maybe learning to repurpose other tools. And as far as that connection, I think, like, to build on to that is, in a setting, whether it's individual or group, you have a safety, an emotional safety, that if something comes in and disrupts it, it's, can I still be vulnerable and that be honored? And so I've found that when people ask me my experiences that put me in that chair, they're really asking, like you identified, can you empathize with my experience? How do I know that? Because if we can't empathize with their experience, if you've never been in the streets or anything, what can you do for me? And I always tell people that I don't share, but I have experiences that make me passionate, and then to communicate that I have empathy without sharing, and disclosing, which is an ethic of therapists. But one of the things I've learned is that as clinicians, we are supposed to be agents of hope and change. We are not the source of hope and change.
Say that again, because that is so important.
Yeah, so we are agents of hope and change,
Yes.
not the source of it. And so when somebody wants us to be that, whether it's asking, can I provide safety? It is finding ways to support them. But still pushing them into doing the self-soothing and being that for themselves, as well as, just as importantly, in a group setting, having each other do that for each other. And so I think that when you find people who come in and are looking for that, somebody said one time that you don't need your doctor to have gone through open heart surgery to know how to do it. And I think that provides a lot of truth for clinicians, because even those clinicians that are in active recovery and long-term recovery, they may have different experiences from the clients. Some people have struggled with alcohol, some people have struggled with maybe a little bit other varying substances. And so just knowing how to create that space is a big part of that. And that doesn't necessarily take anything other than just being a present source of empathy and compassion.
Let's talk a little bit now about what families can do to help someone who's struggling with an addiction.
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing is knowing that you can't force anybody to change. We are all responsible for our own actions and choices. And in fact, in something as isolating as addiction, the empowerment that can come from making our own choices and taking our own actions is part of the empowerment that is needed in those first and early days of the recovery and treatment process. So I always tell families the best thing they can do is learn ways to set healthy boundaries that do not challenge the connection with that person. Now, some boundaries may need to have more separation than others. Some may be, I can give you a meal, but I can't give you money. I can give you a ride, but I can't give you a place to stay. And so it's knowing where are you at, and what are your resources that will not bleed you dry emotionally, financially, relationally, that still allow you to support that person. And the other thing I'll say that I think one of the most important parts is to make changes for yourself, because every relationship, whether we want to admit it or not, has contributed to the cycle of addiction. That does not mean, and I'll caveat this, that doesn't mean that you're responsible for their choices or their actions, but there's been something in the dynamic systemically that has impacted the addiction cycle. And so making change not only helps you deal with what maybe hurts and experiences you have, but it also, when we make a change, we force other people to change. And so if you say, I'm going to be making changes, you're welcome to come along with me. It's an opportunity for a boundary, because now we can say, hey, if you're not willing to make these changes, this has to be my boundary. If you're willing to make change with me and do this journey with me, then we can, the relationship will look different. Because on the other side of that is the person who is treating their addiction. Their changes are also going to force their loved ones to change. And so, if you have a family that is always drinking, and now I got to go home for Christmas, that's going to be a hard environment to be in. But if you go home and you've communicated and they're willing to support you and maybe not drink around you or know what levels of support you need, then that might make it a safer environment to go home. And so I think everybody does have to make some sort of change in order to contribute to the success of the treatment.
I want to tell you about my good friend and someone who is foundational to the community here in Travelers Rest, South Carolina, Melissa Bridgman. 14 years ago, she opened a little boutique store called The Flop Shop, and it is amazing. The dress I'm wearing today comes from The Flop Shop. If you like bold colors that make a statement or flowers that pop, then you want to go to The Flop Shop. If you're looking for an elegant dress that's very affordable to wear out, you want to go to The Flop Shop. If you want to accessorize your dress or casual outfit, go to The Flop Shop. She has a wall of jewelry. She has purses and bags and shoes, all the things us gals like to have. And for you guys who may not know what to get your partner, you can go in there and get a gift card. My husband does that on a yearly basis. So please, if you're in the Travelers Rest area, stop by and say hi to Melissa and let her know that you heard this commercial on solutions for mental wellness.
Here are the questions. So when you were giving the definition of addiction, you said that it is seen as a disease and is treated as a disease. So my question is it a disease that can be cured?
Addiction as a disease and its treatment is not, disease and its treatment as a disease is very treatable. It is very similar to cancer in that there can be periods of remission, and it's a matter of vigilance and mindfulness as to how it's maintained in the long-term process to kind of dictate and differentiate the success in the long term. I think that's why the DSM uses early and long-term remission as definitions rather than, saying cure all, because people face challenges. Life doesn't stop being hard just because we're doing better. There are when we start healing, it does take the highs and lows and maybe rounds them down a little bit so they're not as extreme, and we have more maybe sustainable periods between the lows and more resilient highs. But that still means, and so it gets easier as time goes on, like people say, is because you're just facilitating more resilience through the healing process, but it's still something that has to be vigilantly monitored, if you will.
Okay, when we talked about the importance of a healthy support system, who are the healthiest people? You suggested that they find who the healthiest people are. So not everybody coming from a faith-based background is immediately going to go to the faith-based structures that we would suggest are the healthiest. So who would be some healthiest ideas? Where are the healthiest people? Like, who are the healthiest people and where are the healthiest people?
Yeah. So the healthiest people that you can surround yourself in treating addiction is going to vary from person to person. Some people do really well in a 12-step recovery model, such as AA or NA. Some people really struggle with that, and that's okay. And I would even say to go even further into that is that some people struggle with certain groups compared to other groups. And it's the same way if you don't like your doctor, have an issue with your doctor, you don't give up on treating your health, you find a new doctor that works with you. So there's other community support groups that are out there that are not 12-step, such as FAVOR, that stands for Faces and Voices of Recovery. They're in all pathways to recovery. There's psychotherapy on an individual level. There is group outpatient treatment that goes from a medical model. There are faith-based supports through churches and
like Celebrate Recovery.
And so I think really, and even on top of that, outside of even, I'll say, what we'll call like the recovery support, finding people like maybe who aren't in that community, the healthiest people are going to be the people that demonstrate healthy boundaries, They respect your boundaries just as importantly. So that not manipulative, not maybe not codependent, meaning your emotions are your emotions and nobody else's, because we need that support to make our own choices and not have to feel responsible or be responsible for other people. I'm going to say the healthiest people are not judgmental. They have practice honesty and respect. And so the things that we've been taught our whole lives that make a quality of a good friend, I would say just it's tapping back into those old childhood narratives and saying, oh, this person might be healthy. And that can be hard at times because sometimes it's trial and error. I mean, but at the end of the day, it's also, I think it's learning to trust our gut again. And sometimes for people who have been in addiction so long, knowing their gut and trusting people might have been challenged because their safety may have depended on not trusting people. And so that might be something that can be a challenge as well.
What role does authenticity play in someone who is providing support?
I think it plays a crucial role because, behind the heart of authenticity is honesty. And I think that if you want to align your intentions to, the positive outcome and the goals that are set, that spirit of authenticity and honesty has to be present, because if not, how can challenges be faced and addressed appropriately? How can you share your feelings? Because I'll say that to a deeper respect of the feelings that undermine, if we're not able to deal with hard feelings, if that's somebody's struggle in addiction, then that needs to be what is challenged and done differently in the treating process. So if you can't have that spirit of authenticity to really dig into some of those harder things during times of heightened challenge, then it's not going to provide that, I'll say, the most appropriate support, or let me rephrase that, to the most effective support.
Okay, Zach, I have another question on that topic of who are the healthiest and where are the healthiest. You gave us this great breakdown, but what if the person going through addiction isn't capable of knowing that who and where for themselves? Like maybe their flags aren't going off because they've been in a place for so long. What would you say to that person?
Yeah, I'm going to start with saying it's dependent on the person, because each person, dependent on the level of addiction and the level of, and I'll even say their personal history, they each have different understandings of relationships. Because we can have people outside of addiction who struggle with healthy relationships because of what's called attachment theory, which is basically our experiences, our environments dictate how we seek attention and create connection. And so if somebody's struggled with that, they're already going to have, if somebody comes from a traumatic home of abuse and neglect, they may already struggle with having appropriate flags of when to trust and when not to trust because of those. And so that's going to be, I have seen that create harder issues in the recovery process, because it's not knowing who to trust and then trusting too much inappropriately. There are people who maybe have had healthy childhoods in a respect where they understand healthy boundaries, healthy relationships, and just had a challenge with addictions. I'd even say it also depends on the severity of addiction. So some people who have been in addiction longer, you are looking at biological changes in the brain that might impact the ability to make healthy choices as well as develop healthy relationships, which comes into that red flag and reading those flags. And so it's retraining.
Well, that sounds like what you were talking about at the beginning, that there is a choice, but sometimes there's not a choice. Yeah. And so when someone has used a substance or multiple substances, and there's actually changes to the brain, then the choices go out the window.
Absolutely. Yeah, because addiction really attacks our function of choice. And that's not just, it's a very layman's way of saying it, but it does affect the part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. That is our rational thought and our choice part of the brain, and the relationship it has between our emotions and the limbic system. And so when those wires get tripped up, especially when it weeds out our other connections, you're left with a struggle in really assessing risk, assessing healthy relationships, being able to read and respond to red flags appropriately. And so that is a huge part of the treatment process, is learning how to find a baseline of reading our gut, reading our intuition again. because we're having to learn to it. But it is usually leading us in the right direction. It's how to interpret it that we're also oftentimes having to retrain or relearn.
The importance of group therapy. I love that you said it challenges the narrative of shame and it removes isolation or helps with reconnection. So here's my question. Short answer, how do you feel about the AA model? Because it kind of always remains an addict, they're always an addict, versus a model like, I think there's a book called the Addiction Recovery Model, where they don't preach once an addict, always an addict. How do you feel about that as far as rebuilding scaffolding for people? Like, what do you think is a healthier?
So I say it's different strokes for different folks. Like I said earlier, I think it's what's going to work best for each individual person's needs, because each person some people connect better with that once an addict, always an addict. I'll say for me personally, I like using the medical model and in other forms of therapy like cognitive behavioral therapy. Because also a big part of that, and this goes into a deeper model of therapy for therapists, is it's in the postmodern type of sect of therapy models. And I like it because it's important of the language based on that, the theoretical foundations of that. And so I say words like struggling with addiction rather than addict, because we try and separate the person from the problem. Because when you're the problem, it reinforces this narrative of shame, and shame's already the engine of addiction. And so struggling with it is kind of the kind of that old concept of know thy enemy. When it's separated from it, it's like I can see and I get more choice in response to fight it and challenge it. And so, but again, different strokes for different folks. Some people do really well with the AA model. Some people do not. And so I will be available to whoever wants what feels that'll work best for them. And I have no problem supporting whoever wants to go where, because I have seen each one work.
And the literature says that a pragmatic approach is best.
Yeah.
So finding out what works for the client is going to be what works.
Correct. And I will say a step further, there's more research that says no matter what approach you use of therapy or treatment, as long as somebody keeps showing up, it will eventually work.
And that's really the first part of recovery, is just show up and don't expect any more from yourself or from the other person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for joining us today, Zach, in our podcast. And so on our next episode, we will be talking a little bit more about triggers in recovery, as well as codependency.